Hey, everybody, and welcome to today's show. We are discussing nature versus nurture, the debate between genetics or your environment and your upbringing. Which actually molds us as people? Is it what we were born with and inherited? We're going to be great as a result, or we're screwed as a result? Or can we actually implement this? Can we make changes in our life? Can we pay attention to certain things? It is a hot topic for debate. We've got tons of video clips from all the major experts in the field giving us their insights. We'll give you our opinions as well. And at the end of the day, you'll be much more informed on this topic. So get that comfy chair. Welcome to this week's episode of Quantum Ladder Podcast. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Quantum Ladder Podcast. My name is Louis Borges. Joining me, as always, my good friend and co-host, Marquise Williams.
What's up, everybody? I am super excited about this episode. I honestly can't believe we're doing it. It's the topics we cover here are topics that I wish I could cover just in my everyday life before we ever started this, and now we get to do this. This is fantastic. I'm excited. I think you guys are gonna love this episode. You're gonna love this.
It's an important topic, and again, there's no right or wrong answer. It is still being discovered and being discussed by some of the greatest minds on the topic. We've compiled some of the material from some of the bigger names like Deepak Chopra, Gabor Mate. We've got Bruce Lipton here. We've got a host of experts and also some criticisms that some people say maybe they're not right. And as always, we want to bring you both sides of every argument. You get informed, you make your own decisions. Our opinion is simply that, just an opinion. But we want to give you everything you need to know in regards to this topic. And to get us started here, I put together a little video last week just on the idea of what is nature versus nurture. It's not something most people think of every day, but it's something most people are, in fact, familiar with. So let's take a look here. As we explore the intricate tapestry of human development, one question resonates through the ages. Are we molded more by our genetics, the code we inherited, or by the nurturing we encounter from the world around us? Let's think about nature and the complex genetic code embedded in our DNA. It is the blueprint that lays the foundation of who we are, a dynamic interplay of genes orchestrating the harmony of our existence. But what about nurture? The varied environments we inhabit and the multitude of experiences that shape us, could these have more of a profound impact than the very genetic code that we carry? Can the power of a nurturing environment override the predetermined rhythm of our genes? In our journey of discovery, we'll present professional opinions from experts in genetics, psychology, and philosophy. Do our genes merely set the stage, or do our experiences take the lead in the complex drama of human development? Think of a garden. The seeds represent our genetic code, but it's the combination of soil, sunlight, and care that determines the blossoming of each unique flower. How much of our fate is predetermined, and how much is cultivated through the rich tapestry of life's experiences? Can a challenging environment reveal hidden strengths? Does our genetic heritage act as a guiding star, or are we the architects of our own destiny? Join us on this adventure into the core of the nature versus nurture debate. As we navigate the maze of science and philosophy, let's think about this together. Are we the products of our genes, the environment, or the delicate interplay between the two? There we have nature v nurture. What are your thoughts on where you stand in the whole nature versus nurture debate?
Well, first off, I want to say I thought that AI was taking voice actors' jobs. I think it's actually Louis. I'm supposed to be the voice actor here in this, in this biz here. Looks like I've been replaced. Fantastic freaking job, man.
You
Those
trained
videos
me
are awesome.
well.
Yeah, I didn't train you. I told him one time. He's like, okay, got it, and then he's doing them like every week now. So yeah, this is all you. So my position is, and I think this is probably a worldview that I've held for quite some time. By listening to people like when I was younger, like like uh like the meditation and philosophy, thinkers and the gurus of old, like Wayne Dyer, and you mentioned Deepak Chopra before. So Deepak Chopra, I listen to him a lot. And a lot of the people, a lot of other books that I've read that make me feel like personally that develop my worldview to believe that I think they're both important. I think that when it comes to how what we become and how we become what we become, it is clearly a primary expression of, I believe, of nurture. Obviously, genetics play a role in what we become, especially when it comes to multi-generational stuff, which we'll talk about later. But think about if you're born in one country and you develop a religious and by a sociological perspective, and then you go to another country, everything's different. The whole world is different. You don't think to yourself, oh, I'm biologically predetermined to be this religion. You're born that way, and you're born into that system, that culture, and that's what you normally will become, most likely. And so, for me, the majority of what we are, what we seem to be, is essentially an expression of nurture, I think.
Well, let's get some professional opinions on this, shall we? First up, Mr. Gabor Mate, and hopefully
Yeah,
he agrees to come on our show. We are in talks with him right now. That would be
yeah,
phenomenal. We have a lot of respect for the man, and
yeah.
we've got some of his material in today's show as well. But this is the idea of nature versus nurture in the sense of the examples of Buddha and Hitler.
Buddha was a human being, Hitler was a human being. One is full of compassion and love and giving, the other is full of greed and aggression and hatred. They're both human beings, so how can you talk about a defined human nature? However, what I think we can say confidently, that there's a certain human potential based on human needs. If those needs are met, development will be healthy and those potentials will be realized. If those needs are frustrated, which they severely were in the case of, say, a Hitler, terribly abused child, then what you get is the hatred and the rage and the murderous venom that characterized that personality.
Hmm.
So I think we could all agree that clearly something went one way for a character like Buddha. Clearly something went another. I mean, anyone who has children, Marquise, you've got a whole house full of them, and I've got one. But when they're at that infant stage and they're babies, like there's no babies born bad. Honestly, like they're the most
No.
innocent of creatures. It is us that screws them up, or the environment, or whatever socioeconomic issues. There's a million reasons,
Yeah.
but I don't believe myself any child is born inherently bad. Some people might say I'm wrong, but I don't believe that. I do believe you may have some genetic, if we're talking mental disease or something that was inherited through a physiological problem. Yeah, if the hardware is damaged, the software will never play correctly. So I believe that that can exist. But if we're talking about normal biology, healthy, happy, bouncing baby, I can't see them being born a Hitler. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm with you on that one. Obviously, I think my position is pretty clear, but I did want to share something by someone we're going to talk about a little bit later too. Someone who, for most people, his ideas are very controversial. Um, as a matter of fact, Lawrence Krauss interviewed him right before we had an interview with Lawrence Krauss. He interviewed Robert Sapolsky, and Robert Sapolsky talks about things like predeterminism and free will. Very interesting stuff. Now, I'm not saying I believe it. I'm not saying that I'm with him on 100% everything, but I find it interesting to think about these things. He said something to the effect of in one of his conversations. He said genes can predispose, but they don't predetermine. So let's look a little bit further into this. So that quote highlights kind of the role of genetics, and we're going to talk about genes and genetics a lot in this conversation today. So even though genes, for example, set certain predispositions, or as he says, vulnerabilities, they don't inevitably dictate the outcome of what you are, or the expression of what you are. It's like if you were to give an example, it's like having a map that suggests, possible routes. You said this before, something similar to this before, but they don't force you down any specific path. Somehow you're guided or led down one path or the other. But even so, those paths are already laid down for you to go. And I think that this is kind of a perspective that's vital to understanding how conditions like addiction, which we'll talk about here, and mental illness, which we're going to talk about as well, where there are genetic factors that contribute to significantly, but they're not the sole cause of mental illnesses and addictions.
So you want to watch this free will one?
Let's check it out, man. I think you guys are going to like it.
Robert Sapolsky.
The polite thing that I've sort of said for decades is that, well, if there's free will, it's in all the boring places, and those places are getting more and more cramped. If you want to insist that today you decided to floss your teeth starting on your upper teeth rather than your lower teeth, rather than the other way around, that was an act of free will, whatever, I'll grant that one to you. That's where the free will is. In reality, I don't think there's any free will at all. If you look at the things that come into account as to whether or not someone is going to do the right thing in the next 2 seconds amid a temptation to do otherwise, and the variables in there reflect everything from whether they are having gas pains that day because of something unpleasant they ate that morning, that makes us more selfish, more impulsive, etc., to what epigenetic effects occurred to them than when they were a first trimester fetus. When you look at the number of things we recognize now that are biological, organic, where 500 years ago or 5 years ago, we would have had a harsh moral judgment about it, and instead we now know, oh, that's a biological phenomenon. What we're going to get to the point is recognizing, yeah, we're biological organisms. This notion of free will, for want of a less provocative word, is nothing but a myth.
That's That's really controversial. Sorry, that's really controversial. I know it's controversial, which is why I thought it was interesting to bring up, because he's a very well-respected intellectual. I mean, this guy he's known in the academic community to be a genius. And I mean that literally. I don't mean that as a like a compliment. He's literally considered a genius in the academic world, in the scientific community. It doesn't mean that I agree that there's no free will. I think here's how I interpret what that means. I interpret that as this: we as humans are kind of predisposed biologically or biologically inclined to do things like interact with each other, have social lives, mate, eat, sleep, and the usual things that we go through just to kind of survive and live. But then there are things that we've developed over time through every single era that changed. We no longer hunt for food. Now we have, very modernized systems that provide it for us, if you will. Whether it be irrigation, it started off with just like building, making crops and tending to them. That's actually that's kind of a newer technology. If you think about the grand scheme of, human development, that's pretty new. And now we have production, which is a totally different thing that affects how humans interact with each other and how we live our lives day to day as well. And if this is on top of technology and, and modern civilization in general, all of the ways that we are today, we think that they are just human. But I feel like, based off of what I understand about what he says, the things that we experience, that everybody is, all the things you feel and think and do, they are all influenced by things that are not just biologically predetermined, but also, I guess, environmentally influencing you to be and do and think.
I would agree with when he mentioned the epigenetics of things, which we'll get into a little bit later on. Essentially, external factors that happen during your development stages in uterine. I would agree that it's more than just the genetics, because there are changes that can occur that aren't genetic mutations like we see throughout evolution. I do disagree that we do not have free will. I don't buy that. A lot of what he said, I think, is, and again, I'm not a neuroendocrinologist like he is, but I was a med student, and I have a lot of doctors that are friends, colleagues. They are very rigid on their training as far as science right in front of you. And everything I heard in that video was reactionary. that, oh, if somebody chose to brush the top teeth versus the bottom teeth, that if you think you had free will over that, well, you don't have free will over breathing and your heart rate either. There are systems that happen in your body without needing free will. But I also do believe that on the big existential things, or where you want your life to go, you do have a choice. Some people catch themselves in negative patterns and bad habits and say, I don't like this. This is not me. This is not the me I want to be. And they make positive changes in their life, right? And you can see what happens in people's lives with the lack of good free will, where they just kind of stay in the negative patterns, and that'll never end. They don't have any drive to get out of that. But I also understand that that person might be stuck. And that's to Robert Sapolsky's point, that they don't have a choice. That's just what's in their makeup. But I do think that the nurture has more than just the nature. And there are even some people that have what we would consider, or some people would consider, mental issues like ADHD, that may not be a mental issue. It might be a byproduct of environment, trauma, baggage, stuff that we all have. It manifests itself in weird ways. I went through a period of my life where I had lots of anxiety and lots of stress. I was getting physical manifestations, like the feeling of throwing up before having to go to work. That wasn't just like, I need to rearrange my closet like crazy, and I started getting, weird paranoias about things. It was a physical manifestation of that. I went to a physical physician and then realized I needed to go to a mental specialist, because it was actually as a result of stress, anxiety, too much work, not putting yourself first. So the body and mind can interlap in weird ways. You may think a physical manifestation. I used to get like pains in my stomach. So I would think, hey, maybe I have an ulcer. And then you go and get checked out and there's nothing there. Well, that's coming from mental stress. So the physical body can confuse you that what you have is of the physical, when it might be a conscious-based thing. It might be an environment-based thing, a negative thought pattern-based thing. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy work to help people with realizing that I feel crappy because I'm ruminating on negative ideas, and I'm catastrophizing that the world is going to come to an end if this one thing doesn't go right. And we play out these scenarios that are likely never to happen, but they're just as real to that person in the moment. And we have these patterns that we've developed as a result of nature. My baby, when she was born, didn't have any of that. I'm sure yours didn't either. So that doesn't come as a result of. But I do have a clip here I think we should look at.
Well, I wanted to ask you something about.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, because I feel like this one point is probably the most controversial. Sapolsky's perspective is the most controversial thing we're going to talk about tonight, and I think we'll see. But I do think that it's interesting if you think about this idea of. And again, I'm more along the lines on with you. I think we do have free will. I think we do have choice in some respect, but I think that I think we need to put that into perspective. So, for example, I remember talking about this experiment where they tied a rope to an elephant's leg when it's a baby, and it would only go in a certain radius for years and years and years. And elephants have great memory, by the way, which we all know. And when the elephant hits a certain age, they remove that rope, and from that point forward, pending some anomaly, that elephant will never go outside of that radius its entire life. It's almost perfect how that experiment works with these elephants. The elephant it can trample all over. It could literally just toss us around like we're nothing. It could literally trample all over our vehicles. It can take our weapons. There's nothing we can do to stop an elephant. Nor usually people don't want to either. They don't want to hurt an elephant that wants to be free and escape. But that elephant doesn't get free, even though it's what it would naturally want to be. That's free. So in a sense, that elephant does not have it. It may have the free will somewhere in it, like it can if it wanted to, but the belief that it doesn't have that choice limits its ability to access that free will, because it doesn't even believe it's possible. It's a world or a possibility, that road that we mentioned earlier, that's never been shown to them. So they don't even know it exists. And I think a lot of times with human beings, that is literally what I believe almost every problem in our society, our civilization, on a big level, not a small one. People individually have moment-to-moment choices, but on a big level, when you are doing things and you don't know why, which we all do, when you think things and you don't want to, which we all do, when you react in ways you wish you didn't, which we all do, that's because something has influenced you to do something. And in that moment, you don't think you have a choice. And I think this is kind of what, in my opinion, illuminates the core of, in some respect, what Sapolsky is talking about. I think he just goes a step further, where
But
he's
I
like,
mean, to the point of the elephant, if that were a natural free range elephant, that wouldn't be the case. It would trample you and take off. It's only because of the abuse, let's call it, which we
trauma,
would say is conditioning or
if you will.
training.
Right.
Essentially, it's abuse. And I've heard that same thing where they start off with a chain, and then when the elephant's older, it's just a very thin rope. It just needs
Right.
the symbol of what that used to be. Although it's no longer chain capacity, they could tear it, but again, it's that bondage. It's that baggage we have put on that animal. Same thing with a wild horse, right? You break a horse, you put a saddle on it, you put a bit in its mouth. It can jump the fence and take off, but it doesn't. Why? It's not that horse doesn't have free will.
Right.
It's just the programming we've sort of inserted overrides that. So again, I liken that to abuse. Can somebody, in Robert Sapolsky's example there, somebody that has been nothing but abused and treated poorly and never nurtured, would they have the same free will that somebody who came from a nurturing, happy, healthy environment would have, right? Are their faculties somewhat changed and damaged because of what they've gone through and what they've been shown as normal? Can they even think as what we would think is normal? And again, what is normal? That's all a relevant thing anyway. But I think a lot of times when we feel like, well, we don't have free will because we're doing all these things and don't know why, I think that's a social thing. That's an upbringing thing. That's an environment around you thing. If you grew up in the Middle East where all you saw was fighting for your entire life, would you have a very positive outlook of the world, and
No,
of
of course
people in
not.
general when
Yeah,
you see atrocities and people mutilating bodies in the street? Or if you're like sheltered and go to some private school in New Zealand where everything's all good and you never had any crime or witnessed any of that, you might have a little more belief that those things are possible because you haven't seen the worst of mankind. But again, this is experiential that causes that bias. Both of those kids born brand new don't know anything about peace or war. They're just creatures. So they weren't born with that negative outlook on things. It's as a result of what they went through that they developed that bias. And I would argue that we are who we are as a result of everything we went through, except in the fact of genetic disability, where you didn't have a choice. You're born with like spinal muscular atrophy or something that you're gene deficient. Yeah, you didn't have a choice in that. And now it has a very severe impact on the rest of your life. That is sort of the world of epigenetics, which we'll get into. But I wanted to cover this from the spiritual aspect. So I wanted to find, a holy person who could speak on this. So I have a clip from Rabbi Manis Friedman, who's basically a believer of it is not nature or nurture. It is both all together at the same time. One cannot exist without the other. And he's got some interesting sentiments. So let's check it out.
Nature and nurture. When you bring them into harmony, you have found the right path in life. Nature should not be in conflict with nurture, and nurture should not ignore nature. The nature with which we are born is perfect for the things we want to nurture. If you find them in conflict, you're doing something wrong. You're either not understanding your nature or you don't have a very good policy for nurture. Raise a child according to its understanding. Don't go against their nature and don't let nature take its course. Nurture the nature. Boy, that's good. That is perfect. So now the question is, what is our nature? Okay, there are aggressive people, there are passive people. There are gentle people, there are forceful people. There are intelligent people, and there are doers. Each according to their nature, they should be nurtured in the value of their nature. In what positive way can you use an aggressive personality? In what constructive way can you use a passive personality? Don't fight the nature. Nurture it. Turn it into a productive force, no matter what it is. So we should never be jealous of someone else's personality, someone else's nature, and we should never say, well, with the nature I have, I can't expect to accomplish much. Nurture the nature. That's following God's plan.
So take what you've been given with and work with that. And one of the things I recently come across as a fairly new parent is this idea of Montessori. Have you heard of this for schooling?
Yes, the Montessori method. Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's
Montessori is basically let everybody develop at their own level. Don't give them the standard conditions you have from grades and tests, and you're at a grade 4 level or a grade 5 level. They'll just put a bunch of random puzzles and project kid that's in grade 2, but he's playing with something that's for a grade 6 because that's that
Mhm.
potential that kid has. So they let them go with that. They don't tell them that, hey, you're too young to be able to figure that out. They just let them do that. They let them learn and develop at their own pace. Montessori is not just a way of schooling, it's kind of a parenting style of,
Right.
like understanding your child more than just trying to make them something or condition them into be something. And I'm a byproduct of strict European immigrant parents where you just didn't talk back. They told you to do it and you did it, right? But is that really the best way to raise somebody? Maybe they could have found out why I was feeling the way I was feeling,
Right.
understand that it's okay to feel that way because of age and experience or just emotional fire that I had. I would have developed maybe understanding myself a little better at a younger age. Now, I had a great upbringing, lots of love, lots of support, no complaints. But I'm just saying, parents can only do what they know, right? My father was raised by a strict, badass Portuguese guy who'd probably tear your butt
Yeah.
apart if you talk back, right? So my dad was a lot more nature or mild in nature, but still a tough guy that you don't talk back to and don't mess around with, right? So there was always that element of fear of like, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, there are repercussions rather than let's help you find what you want to be doing. Let's give you a purpose. You know what I mean? So I'm very interested in this idea of Montessori and what Manis Friedman just said there is that nature is irrefutable. It is within all of us. You can either fight it or go with it. So how do you nurture the best out of what is already within that person? And I think therein lies kind of because there's no right or wrong answer to this question or debate,
Yeah.
but you're getting closer to the answer when you start to realize we are unique. We have a unique set of challenges, and figuring that out is part of the solution of who we are and what makes us tick. That makes a lot of sense to me.
So I have something to present here, and again, we don't I don't know the answers at all. I just feel like I'm definitely more along the lines of how environment influences genetics or the expression of genes. And of course, you mentioned about epigenetics before. That's also a factor of well, I mean, environmental factors do influence epigenetic changes in a person's biology. So when I think about what you just said, and when I think about what he said, I was almost with him. With you, I'm with you. There was something different about what you're saying and what he's saying, though. I'm not sure if you guys can hear this, but what you just said, and I'm talking to the audience right now. What you just said, I think, is very different in substance compared to what he said. He suggested that a person that is aggressive, that a person that is docile, that is mild tempered, that has any of these different behaviors, right? He calls that natural. Well, I that is not, at least according to what I understand about psychology and about especially sociology. If you think about this on a broader scale, people they're not just born aggressive, right? We mentioned this. You mentioned this before. Babies aren't born hating or being prejudiced or being anything other than just curious and expressive, totally open and expressive. It takes certain environmental influences, family, trauma, people around you, friends, whatever social influences, or things that you stimulate yourself with, whether in the environment, like movies and videos and music. These are the kind of things that influence the kind of expressions of behavior like aggression, or the alternative would be mild temperedness. And so you said this is crazy because the funny thing to me is that you're saying something that I resonate with more than what he's saying,
To
but
me,
you
it
think
feels the same. I
it's
don't I
not.
don't see the
It's very
difference.
different.
I'm
It's
curious.
so this is what I think is so interesting. So when a person, and again, we mentioned, I kind of went over a little bit of how the expression of these behaviors, it doesn't come from nowhere. It develops, especially at adolescence. Gabriel Mate, I'm going to talk about a lot, of course, he talks about childhood development a lot and about trauma and things like that, which we're going to get into. And the one thing, a lot of things that he references are examples of people who have trauma and they become dependent or they become they have addictions, for example. It doesn't have to be like a drug addiction, although usually it is. It could be things like eating or sex or food, or I'm sorry, or workaholics, which you just said you were, right? These are expressions or manifestations of trauma. In your case, it's probably the feeling of wanting to be the best. I feel like you're an overachiever, and you have this like innate desire to just want to just accomplish everything at 100% at the very least, or else you're just not good enough. You could do better. It comes out with with everything that you are. And Gabriel Mate talks a lot about that feeling coming from a place where at one point in your life you felt like you weren't enough. And so he says, and I'm not psychoanalyzing you here. I'm not a psychologist. This is just what I've learned from these people, especially just researching this in a very brief amount of time. Let me be honest with you guys. I've been researching this for years, but for the show, for a short amount of time. It is mostly environmental influences that contradict environmental influences that equal or turn out to express themselves in these behaviors that contradict what that person, that gentleman, said. And I believe that's buried within your comment is the opposition to what he said.
Well, for me, what I would say is I would argue as an overachiever, it wasn't that I felt like I wasn't enough and that's why. It was the fear of ever getting there. So at a very early age, I was good at most things. Like I started running track and field in like grade 1, and I was beating kids in like grade 4. And then I was getting straight A's. My report cards were always the same: straight A's and a C in printing, because I would not slow down or take my time to do it neatly. I couldn't write as fast as my brain would think. So I would just write it out, and the teachers would always give me a hard time and say, you has to be clear. In my mind, who cares if it's clear or not? You can read it. It's the right answer. Therefore, I should get full marks. And I was always very, resisting to that. My teachers would always say, Louis is our best student, but he distracts other kids in class, because teacher would put up the assignment for nighttime. I hate homework. I would do that assignment in class and then chat with my friends. Unfortunately, they weren't doing the same. They needed to hear the lesson. It was, counterproductive for them. For me, it was just like, this is a piece of cake. What are we doing after school? We playing basketball or baseball today. And I didn't realize that some other kids needed that development and that teacher input more. I'm the kind of person you can just say, read these chapters, do the questions at the end, and we're good to go. And I was very successful at that. So again, I agree with what you said. I am unique because of, just like all of us, because of our unique upbringing. My father came to this country, couldn't read, couldn't speak English, couldn't write. He had no choice but to work construction. And if you know the weather in Canada, in some cities, it's very extreme. Like I grew up in Toronto. So he was a roofer for the school board, melting sheets of rubber in 40 degrees Celsius heat with a 900 degree torch. And he did this for 30 years. And consequently, it's minus 30 outside. He's got to go climb a ladder, get up in the wind, and try not to slip and fall and break his neck. So I always had that as my example of sometimes work is suffering. And if my father can do that, then I really have no right to complain about anything ever again. So maybe it was a subconscious thing that I had, that I didn't want to disappoint the same people that I saw putting in the effort they were putting in. So you could argue it came from them and I, wore off on me, or I wanted to remain in that high esteem level, in that high level of support and love and reinforcement. So I just kept going because that's what got me the love and reinforcement. Who knows? I don't know myself. I can't even psychoanalyze myself, but I do think there is, it's both. It is not nature versus nurture. That's why I like the rabbi. I think we say something similar in the sense that, some people are inherently a certain way, but I also believe that they need to be dealt with as a result. Has your 2-year-old ever gone nuts and just start throwing things around, screaming, kicking things?
Every night. Every night.
So one could argue, that's an aggressive child. Is it?
Right.
Or is it a 2-year-old struggling to figure out their own emotions? And some people even theorize that the child is telling you when they have a tantrum that they love you and trust you so much that they can be vulnerable around you with these feelings. Because my little one doesn't usually have a tantrum in front of a stranger. If she meets somebody new or she's in a,
quiet, calm.
She'll just be quiet and observing. But when she's with us, it's like, hey, we're all buddies. I can be my real self. So you can look at it that he is giving me a hard time, or know that the love and trust is so strong that they're showing you that they're having a hard time. And so you could reinforce that. Like, I know you don't feel good right now. It's okay. We're here for you, like, and that may seem something that you can't do to a 2-year-old, but you can. And there are many theories on that. I do have one here in terms of,
Well, I do want to say something. I did have something in response to that last thing you said.
sure.
Because I learned this, and it's something that I tried to recognize myself in the moment. It's difficult. I mean, nobody's perfect, and as parents, we're trying to be the best we can, and we fail. I fail a lot. But what I've learned actually is that it's fear that makes the child become less reactive around other people, and the fear of something happening to them or someone harming them. It's actually something that's like ancient.
Yes.
That feeling of being afraid to be around an unknown. Whereas with us, there is that safety. You mentioned about the safety, security feeling they have with us, which is why they express themselves. That's one element. However, the actual core of why they act out that way, it's obviously there are many different reasons, but usually there's a communication error, something they're trying to get across to us that we do not understand, and they actually know that they've either attempted to or don't know how to tell us.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's true. I just, from what I've learned, that's kind of what I've taken from those behaviors and what I've learned about those behaviors myself. A lot of this is really perspective, though. I think we're going to hear that a lot.
Sure.
I don't know what's going on, but
I agree with what you're saying there, where they're trying to tell you and they're getting frustrated at us because either they can't enunciate it or they think they're enunciating it just fine and we're not getting it.
like,
And especially at the language development stage where they're using similar words for many things, they may be asking for something and you're like, is it this? Is it this thing? Is it that? And they're like, no, like they're getting
Like,
very
what is it?
upset that we can't read their mind, but they don't speak English very good, so not yet, at least anyway.
Not yet.
But to mention what I was saying about the point of babies not being born with any of that, you talk about what's called altruism, which is sort of that innate wanting to be nice. And we have it right from when we're born. So here's a short clip on altruistic babies.
Why are we altruistic? Is it innate, or is it something that we learn over time? It's probably a little bit of both, but this famous study shows that 18-month-year-old children show an automatic and spontaneous tendency to help others, such as this experimenter who is pretending to struggle to open a cabinet. Additionally, our close evolutionary relative, the chimpanzee, shows the same tendency toward automatic and spontaneous helping. I'm a psychology researcher. Follow to learn about more cool studies.
So what do you think? Is there a little bit of goodness in all of us and that just gets screwed up as we go through life?
I'm going to affirm and reject this simultaneously. Okay.
Okay.
So on the one hand, I agree with him because it's clear that even from my observations, that my 2-year-old, she does try to help, or if somebody seems sad, she will hug them, or if somebody seems, like they need help with something, she'll help them. However, that is not altruism. Okay, so let me be careful here because I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychologist, sociologist, or whatever. I understand altruism to be putting someone else's needs before your own. It's the self-sacrifice in the moment. So, for example, an example of altruism, in essence, wouldn't be a child helping someone open a door. It'd be, I have 2 cookies and I want them both, but I want you to have one. Or I have 1 cookie, but you seem sad about me not having that. I want you to have my cookie. That would be
would they have that faculty at 18 months old? At 18 months, I can see that being an exercise of 3-year-old who understands the concept of sharing. My 2.5-year-old now gets it, where I'll give her a bunch of crackers. I'll take one. She'll get mad. And then I'll say, remember, we share. And then she'll give me like 2 or 3. I have to remind her. Again, that's implanting that. But this experiment was done for an 18-month-old baby, something that has a hard time verbalizing. But just from seeing another human in need or stuck for something or can't reach, the natural tendency, it's not 100%, but the majority, the natural tendencies, for some reason, they want to help or they want to be involved or they want to somehow contribute and feel like they're equal to the adult.
I agree. I'm glad you mentioned about the age thing, because during childhood development, it is around 3 years old that they start to become more aware of, much more aware of their external environment and the people's feelings, to where they can have that higher level thinking. Yeah, usually they have more of a selfish, self-centered way of thinking, because it's biological. They don't really have a choice, if you will. It's biological. Most children, their perceptions are very limited to their own body and their own experiences. To be able to think outside of themselves, to be able to imagine what somebody else feels, that takes a lot. That takes a lot of certain neurons and brain development for them to even get to that point. So I agree with you about that 100%. The only contention I had was with the definition, or the example of altruism. I feel like he's conflating kindness with altruism, or charitability with altruism. They are vastly different. I believe that altruism is the epitome of what, if you want to believe in a good person, and I post this before on Facebook, to believe that there is a good person, the epitome of a good person is someone who's altruistic, somebody who will, for example, risk their freedom so that one day, 50 years from now, other people will be able to experience freedom. Somebody who will risk their life, somebody who will starve themselves, who will fast until people are given the rights they believe that everyone should be equal should have access to equally. That's altruism. Whereas kindness would be, oh, you can walk under my umbrella. Altruism would be, here, you can have my umbrella.
But I would argue that is as a result of your upbringing, your parental influences, the values that you now accept as core beliefs. And I'll give you an example. A lot of police that become police officers, the father, the grandfather.
I'm kidding.
I didn't hear you. What'd you say?
Oh, I'm so glad. No, I was just joking. It was a bad joke.
Okay, so I'll continue then. If it was a bad joke. So think about it. A lot of cops became cops because their dad was a cop, or firemen. It runs in families, in lineages. So you could argue, oh, they're genetically predisposed to be a cop or a fireman, because look how many in the line have done it. But was it that, or was the example that they saw what gave them the positive opinion? Was that they grew up being told your daddy's a hero, he helps people, you should be a cop one day? Did he have pictures as a 4-year-old with a cop hat at Christmas? And was that programmed into them from family? That's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to aspire to help people. But was that the conditioning, or are they literally genetically born as a good cop and just found their, what I mean? We do those things. I would also argue that altruism, or in the case of that clip with the baby, the wanting to help and stuff like that, if you had a child that felt vulnerable in their development years, that was never given assistance, never given support, never given love, how likely is that person to grow up to want to give those things back? So cops may have a generational succession. How many serial killers have kids that become cops? I'm just saying. I believe it is. What's that?
Dexter is a pretty
real ones, not made up ones.
I'm kidding.
You never heard of. Well, I do have one example of serial killers running in families. It's a quick clip here. It's for a real crime podcast. But essentially, this guy studies a particular person. And I think in the clip, he says there's 9 people in the family have all become serial killers. So it's not just something like, hey, little Johnny went the wrong way. No, the whole bloody family is like that. And so that keeps the sort of nature believers of saying that, no, there is something inherent in there. A psychopath you could see it on a scan. There's something about them. They're born that way. And the study of that, it could go good or bad. What if you start limiting kids in school because you're you have a psychopathic gene? You're probably going to kill us one day. The ramifications are the field of education, health, criminal justice, even social policy. Should people that have a predisposition to psychopathy be given the same rights as people that don't? You're way more likely to murder somebody with that predisposition. But how do you blame somebody for something they haven't done yet? That is not fair or ethical. So it gets deeper, but here's a little clip on actual nature of bad things, not just bad upbringings. And you could argue this whole family was messed up, I guess, but check it out.
Are some people just born evil? It's a question various psychologists, philosophers, academic researchers, members of law enforcement, the judicial system, and just regular old schmucks like me have long pondered. Is an individual's criminal behavior more influenced by their genetics or their circumstance? The classic nature versus nurture debate. And we're going to revisit that debate today. Serial killer Terry Blair, the prospect killer, certainly got me thinking about it again. I've never come across a serial killer with more other killers in their immediate family than this guy, at least not in modern times. Terry's crimes were definitely influenced by his upbringing. The only question is, how much? Terry Blair was charged with the murders of 8 women after being caught in September of 2004. And shortly before he was caught, he'd just been released from prison on parole after serving 21 years for killing the mother of his 2 children. This week, we'll discuss the life and crimes of Terry Blair, as well as the many crimes of his family, follow the investigation that led to the capture of the prospect killer, Terry Blair, and more.
So there's a family where everybody was a killer. Now, is that genetic, or is it just the whole family, their upbringing? It's a cultural issue. What would cause something like that?
So let me be a little vague, and then I'll leave it up to the audience, at least for this moment, to fact check me, if you will. I remember watching a documentary that talked about the epigenetic changes that are in people. I'm sorry, the epigenetic changes that influence people, that influence them to become something. Apparently, and this is a very vague memory of this information. If a person has cancer, breast cancer, for example, in their family, then they are more likely to get breast cancer,
Yes.
genetically, right? But let's say that there's a family of sisters that has a mother or a grandmother that had breast cancer. Those sisters, although all predisposed to have a higher chance of eventually the breast cancer gene, which is in all of us, by the way, to express itself, it can be determined by epigenetic influences from your environment.
Yes.
And so I think that just like the breast cancer situation that I heard about, and this is a while. If you really want to learn about these kind of things, Gabriel Mate is the guy to go to. But he, and many other people too. But I mean, in terms of the digestible and a lot of information available out there, it's those influences, those environmental influences that affect epigenetic things, epigenetics in a person to make them more likely to have those genetic expressions. But I wanted to mention something earlier. Maybe I'll save it for the after show. I'll save it. Because you said,
yeah, and we're going to do epigenetics in the second half. We're going to break down things like exactly what you were saying, that all these people could be born, same parents. Why does one sister get breast cancer and the others don't? And the reason being is that there are external influences in addition to the genes you inherit that can cause these things to manifest. So I'm going to explain this diagram in the second half. But basically, there is a link between development, environmental chemicals, drugs, aging, diet, all that stuff that eventually leads to things like cancer, autoimmune diseases, mental disorders, and diabetes. So there is a actual medical and scientific explanation of what could be happening. We're going to get into all that. I just realized, Marquise, we got so excited doing this show.
Wow.
We didn't even load our video clips for our closing and our break. So that's how asleep I am. I've got it good to go now. And I'll be sharper for the second half. So I
think we were really, this is a passionate, I feel like we're all curious about this topic. I mean, it's about who we are and what does it really mean to be human? What's in our nature? What is our true nature? And versus what things make us who we are. Everybody wonders these things. So I'm passionate. Yeah, this is a passionate conversation.
That's why we like doing this show. We're having these big discussions on our personal level anyway, talking, chatting, sending material. We like to include our audience in this discussion. And like we always say, everybody has an opinion. Everybody's opinion is welcome. Take our research here, read more on the subject, go form your own opinion, but don't just gloss over the topic, right? The thing here is you want to develop somehow, get a richer understanding of it. Think about it, right? Like, is it nature or is it nurture? Just in this respect, but having that healthy topic set of both ends, we're all going to form an opinion, but at least they're educated opinions. It's not just, oh, I read something once and I don't believe that. How educated is that? No doctor ever became a doctor by reading something once. You know what I mean? So put in the effort. It's worth it. And if anything else, it's a lot of fun, and we love everybody hanging out with us. And there will be an additional episode at the end of this. If you join our Quantum Club, the link is in the description. We record another episode after these episodes, a little more unfiltered and candid, things we can't say on YouTube and that type of thing. And that's as little as $5 a month. And you also help support the show. We're not running any commercials. We hope you all appreciate that. But it is expensive doing what we do. And it's been great so far. Everybody's given us awesome feedback. We've got some big names as usual in the works. And yeah, so we'll take our break. We'll refill our coffee. We'll see everybody back here in about 5 minutes. Stick with us. podcast. There we are. Well, we are all switched up. All right, you go on the left this time, Marquise. I'll hang out on the right.
Yeah, I can fix that. Yeah,
There we go. Right, we are back. Before I get into that little infographic there in terms of the nature versus nurture, what are some things epigenetic wise? I do want to get into, we mentioned a bit about sort of maternity and things that can happen in uterine. There is a Australian nanny that put together a video on nature versus nurture. I forget what it's entailing, but I found it relevant to the show. So let's run that. And then we can get into the world of epigenetics, things that happen right from the time of conception all the way up through our development. So let's take a look.
Okay, team, let's break it down. Nature versus nurture. What does it actually mean? Your child is born with innate characteristics that will, in some ways, almost predetermine how they respond to their environment, the people within it, and the experiences that they have. The way that they are nurtured will then impact the habits they develop and in turn their responses also. So it's very delicately intertwined, and basically the language that we use, the methods, our beliefs, everything that we do, the things that the children in our care witness from us will have an impact. For example, let's say that your child is very naturally sensitive, and that means to the environmental factors such as the light, the noise, clothing. They're putting their sock on in the morning and it's not quite right and they go bonkers because it doesn't feel right. If you are naturally sensitive, when they start crying and kicking up a stink over this sock, you might be very much okay, we've got to sort this out because you can't really cope with this noise and you just somehow have to figure it out. You start looking for seamless socks. We eradicate all seams in clothing. So the nurture of their nature might go on to create quite a big deal in terms of which clothing they wear. You know, you get the picture. But if you're naturally low in sensitivity and you're looking at this situation thinking, it's a sock. It's an actual sock. Put the sock on. And somehow your child manages to cope with the sock on. Over time, what could have been a very natural dislike towards socks has become desensitized, and it's something that, you know, they've just learned to live with. So nature versus nurture is incredibly important when we consider the behaviors that we have in a home that are causing everyday challenges and, you know, things that perhaps you're sitting down in an evening and thinking, Lord help me, how do I deal?
So it's not the sock, right? I think a lot of times we tend to think of the stressor as the thing. It just might be your predisposition to those kind of things drive you nuts more than they might somebody else. And we display that even at a very young age.
Right. You're gonna get you're gonna get me to push back on this, right? Because you know what I think I've noticed a theme here, and this is what, again, I'm not a doctor, people. This is my perspective, but the theme that I notice is that people who have this perspective, they're correct. That is 100%. What she said is 100% correct. However, we're still looking at like things from what I believe are like the surface level. If you dig a lot deeper, or for example, if you go back far enough, we talked about if you can go back to as far as the embryo, when you're developing in your mother's womb. Everything that your mother and Robert Sapolsky talks about this, and Gabriel Mate and other people who are in the biological development and so forth, they all neurobiology, neuropsychology. It's almost unanimous from what I've read. Most of them say the same thing that I've read, that these things are developed as far back as before your grandparents were born. Let alone what you feel in your mother's womb based off of what she experiences. So if for example, your mother is abused and is in a violent and aggressive relationship, her body will release these neurotoxins and cortisol and things like that to help these stress hormones that will transfer to the baby. And as a consequence, many things can happen, but all kinds of aberrant behaviors will develop. They will express themselves on top, if you will, epigenetic, which is, I believe, like on top of what's already genetically there from the generational things. There are these now epigenetic things that are being activated within a person at the embryonic level that make you become more sensitive or whatever it may be to these different situations. So on the one hand, yeah, that's correct, but it doesn't go back far enough. And I'm the person that believes that, not that there's no free will, I don't believe that at all. Again, I believe that there are too many influences that happen to us environmentally that are almost entirely responsible for the exact expression that you see in every single way, other than that which is autonomic, like breathing, your heartbeat, the flow of your blood, and so forth.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I happen to have a clip on a little deeper dive on exactly what you were just saying. So that was surface level. You're right. But I happen to have many levels here. So
All
here's
right, let's
level
do it.
2 of in uterine epigenetics. Check this out.
So let's say this is your maternal grandma when she was pregnant with your mom. This is the fetus of your mom in her womb. And in that fetus is her little baby ovary. And her baby ovary already contains all the eggs that go on to become her kids, i.e. you. So anything that your maternal grandmother went through in her pregnancy directly impacted your mom, which in turn directly impacted the egg that went on to become you. Similarly, when you're pregnant, if you have a female fetus, then that baby has already her ovaries with her eggs, and those eggs go on to become your grandkids. So anything that you experience, what you eat, how you manage stress, what you go through in your pregnancy directly impacts your kid, and if it's a female fetus, impacts your grandkids.
I have a comment. And this is a personal perspective. That was a fantastic short video, by the way. That was fantastic. It makes me wonder, and I don't know this, but one could imagine that women, birthing people, the women that can have children, they may have that maternal instinct to nurture, to be loving, to be caring. Not just like as a man, you're like, where you see this is surface level here. We may be like, don't you coddle the baby too much, or don't you? But they understand that they are not just nurturing the child in the moment. Maybe there's some kind of a biological, like a predisposition to want to be nurturing for the generations to come, for their generations, for the continuation of each generation. I wonder that, because that right there, and thinking about what we talked about previously, makes me wonder if like there's this like, again, this biological pull where women are like, I have to be loving and nurturing now. I have to be protective and so forth now, and have a softer touch to these different situations now, not because of not wanting to discipline, but because the response, the changes that happen within the child, they're being learned, they're being developed and made now for every generation to come. That's kind of it's a belief. I don't know this. I don't have a data point or fact, but just based off of that, it makes me wonder.
Yeah, and we may not be that far off from the animal world, right? Like, you don't go near a mother bear when she's got cubs, because
Right.
that's when she is the most dangerous animal on the face of the earth. So we look at that as like, well, that's just nature taking care of itself, survival of the fittest. It's teaching the cubs everything it needs to survive, how to hunt and things like that. And then you look at like lion cubs fighting and playing. They're practicing their prey instinct and hunting and things like that. But we're more social creatures. So when you take that into sort of an advanced animal such as ourselves, it is not necessarily we're learning hunting and foraging techniques. It is more the social interplay. And you're right. Maybe there is something within the human psyche that we don't even know, that the human maternal instinct is nurture, because I'm not just nurturing this child, it's this child, its ovaries, their children. And some estimates are that this can go up to as many as 7 generations.
Yeah.
Now, again, in the world of this nurture, it's kind of double edged. You have the biological, which are like things that could happen in uterine epigenetic, but then we also
Right.
have like social, environmental, culture, family, religion, all those things that change once we are here, that also don't come from nature and genes alone, right? So it's kind of double edged.
That makes me want to bring up the next video, which is about the brain and poverty. And then this is controversial. So depending on your perspective, you may like what's being said, you may not. And I know you have thoughts, and I desperately want to hear what you have to think about this next video.
Sure. This is The Brain and Poverty?
Yes.
Studies by now showing at age 5, already kindergarten-aged kids, there is a relationship between your socioeconomic status and the thickness of your frontal cortex and its resting metabolic rate. What's the part of the brain that has some of the highest levels of receptors for glucocorticoids? The frontal cortex. What do glucocorticoids do to the frontal cortex? They atrophy neurons there. So what you are already seeing is get yourself an unfortunate, imprudent decision in terms of which family you got yourself born into and be raised with the stress of poverty. And by age 5 already, there are socioeconomic differences in the size and the activity of the frontal cortex. And that is, I think, one of those factoids that should have like people rioting at the barricades in terms of how screwed you are, how early on in life, in the most like straightforwardly neurobiological way.
Yeah, so I disagree with that. Again, I'm not a neuroendocrinologist, but he's basically saying you're born in a poor family, you're screwed, nothing you can do about it. I would argue that with the stresses of poverty, perhaps the enrichment isn't there. The family structure may not be there. There may be addiction, negative things. Again, as a result of other people having stresses that they can't cope with in their own life. This is now a generational thing. I don't believe that the amount of money in your parents' bank account affects the development of your frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is developed by stimulation and by repetition, by observation, nothing to do with social economic. Now, I would agree that political or monetary issues could lead to a lack of good parenting, a lack of correct developmental tools or aids. If somebody's working 5 jobs and you're maybe being raised by a grandparent or a daycare, maybe the opportunity where that malleability is at its greatest isn't fully being utilized. Therefore, uptake isn't there. The absorption rates of things may not be on par with others. And or if the kid may have issues focusing, it's because they're witnessing this trauma and this turmoil in their life. I do not believe that is a result of direct biology being manipulated by the political or the social status of the family. I don't buy that.
This is one of my favorite conversations to have, to be totally honest with you. Because I mean, again, I think this is a lot of this has to do with perspective. I really believe personally that I don't think that what he said does, but in terms of the interpretation of what he said, and how much of what he said in terms of the degradation of or the degeneration of neurological activity in neurons, how much of that does matter when it comes to what someone becomes in relation to their choice, to the choices that they make and their ability to make those choices.
Now, if he was raised in a family where mom was all by herself, working 3 jobs, but he became a doctor, his brother became a lawyer, everybody's a high achieving person, would he still be saying the same thing, that it was their poverty level that kept him back in life? No, he's speaking with his own bias, probably as somebody who came from a well enough family that they could afford med school. So he can't really give a valid opinion on that which he believes comes as a result of the opposite of his own experience. That is strictly opinion-based talking. And to his point earlier, if there is no free will, then he has no choice but to say that, because it's been ingrained in him his whole life. And that is his bias that we all are, guilty of having. But I doubt if he was an example of an overachiever who came from really crappy circumstances, and they exist. There are people that have worked multiple jobs, Mexican families who have collected bottles out of dumpsters for 10 years to send 3 kids to university. So would he have that same opinion if he, in fact, was a byproduct of a crappy home life, but made something out of that? I think it's because he's a byproduct of a healthy environment, what he considers to be that, non-traumatic upbringing, no turmoil. Hey, I did good because it just genetically, that's how it was. No, it was because he had the opportunity to do that. People have even said on a racial level, certain races don't have the same IQ as other. When you're studying racially oppressed groups, and now you're comparing them to people that were giving all of the opportunity in life, of course, the ones given all the opportunity are statistically going to do more. Beat your dog every day and see if it's friendly versus the one that you pet every day. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that there is a correlation.
In some cases, beat your dog, beat I don't know, like 30 generations of dogs and see what happens to the
There you go.
following 30
That's
generations,
it.
right? So
And
so
great point on that, because that is exactly what Deepak says. This is a 40-second clip, but you
let's
talked
hear it.
about
I think it's
generations.
relevant. I think it's relevant. Yeah.
We
Let's hear
saw
it.
the video of in uterine that your mom already had the egg for you. And if you're a female, you already were born with the eggs for your little one. So especially if it's females birthing females, there are multiple implications of smoking
Mhm.
during pregnancy, malnutrition, diet. I have a clip on diet, but I think the length of genes is more relevant at this point. So let's hear from our friend Deepak Chopra on epigenetics and the genetic effects it have moving forward.
Epigenetics, from what I understand, tells us that just because like two people might have the cancer gene, but it only gets turned on for one person. And what turns it on? Is that where you kind of think like you're not a victim to your genetics?
There are animal experiments where you can take a mouse, for example, and the mouse is exposed to a pleasant smell, let's say lavender, and loves the smell. But if you give the mouse mild electrical shocks while you give the mouse the same pleasant smell, then for the next 7 generations, the mice are afraid of lavender, even though they've never been shocked electrically.
7 generations is the implication of that simple
It's wild.
experiment.
Yeah, that's wild. I think I'm glad you played that. I think that this is kind of, again, I feel like the theme is not being seen here. Brother. I think what gets me the most about this topic is that when I mentioned earlier, and I say this, I'm going to keep repeating this. I think a lot of this has to do with perspective. But the question when it comes to how we see things, but let me be very clear. What I mean isn't that that the truth is a matter of perspective. The truth is what it is. The facts are what they are. However, our interpretation of those facts is about perspective. So when I hear something like that, I think, oh, clearly nurture has a massive impact on the outcome of generations of behaviors of an organism, right? Or whatever that may, well, organisms, because they're the only thing that express behaviors that I understand. And with what you're saying is that, yes, however, right, on top of that, people do have personal responsibility, individual choice. They can choose to break free from those generational curses, if you will. And that is also true. I think they are both true. However, you also mentioned earlier that it's statistically unlikely. It is a statistical anomaly for a generation of a new generation of kids, for example, to go to college when the last, several didn't even read a book, which we
Now,
know
is that from lack of wanting to go to college or lack of financial ability to go to college?
That's a good question. So think about this, right? When I'm going to save this conversation, this element of the conversation in depth for the after show because it's too touchy for YouTube. You're probably going to want to see that, chat. I will make this available for the lower tier or on the Patreon.
Are we doing some swearing? We're going to be swearing?
We're going to be talking about some very, very sensitive topics. And I don't want to, again, I got to be YouTube's, flag
YouTube
for
is
everything.
YouTube. We got that.
Yeah.
That's why you should join our Quantum Club. You get another 4 episodes a month that are not publicly released.
Yeah.
And we just started doing it. We've already got a couple subscribers. And thank you, Scott Rosen, our latest Quantum Club member. Appreciate the love.
Thanks,
one thing that I see, and I see your frustration, is that it seems to be surface level. But again, because there are several, it's what you want to consider nature. So is nature the genes you were born with, or is nature mom having a proper diet when she's pregnant with you, taking the proper supplements? For example, folic acid. If a woman doesn't take folic acid during pregnancy, the child has an extreme high rate of having a cleft lip, right? You've seen babies unable to smile, reconstructive surgery, all that. That's as simple as folic acid can fix that. So that is not even
among
environmental stressors or, mom was stressed out or wasn't eating right. It's literally at a biological level, the embryo needs that vitamin, if you want to call it that, just to develop at a normal way. So nature in itself is kind of the nurture. And that goes back to what the clip I played on Rabbi Friedman there. He's saying that they go hand in hand, that it is the nature itself that needs to be nurtured. So if you're pregnant, the nature is that you have a growing embryo in your body. You need to make sure your vitamin and nutrition levels are as such. because there's added draw on the system. And although as an adult, you don't need folic acid, in that little moment of time, you do. So paying attention to that, yes, its environment, the baby is getting it from its environment, but it's coming from a nurturing place of love and understanding that the mother is supplementing. So it is neither nature nor nurture. It is both.
Well, what the rabbi does, though, and I think I'm not sure exactly why, but what he does is he mentions again, and I'm being redundant a little bit, but I'm going to add to this. He mentions that, for example, anger and aggression is natural. That's not biologically or scientifically or psychologically true.
Well, it's not proven. It has not been proven.
I apologize. You're right. Again, I'm not.
No. I'm agreeing with you. What I'm saying is you're
Yeah.
right. It has not been proven that anger comes from a
Well,
biological sense.
Actually, the exact opposite is true. So it has been studied and it shows, at least it appears to be true. I should say. I'm glad you said that in a way that you did, because I have to be careful. I tend to make these definitive statements and use superlatives. I don't want to do that here. In my personal life, my imperfection is very obvious. But for example, he mentions that again, that aggression and these behaviors, these are expressions of something else. I argue from my personal perspective, based off of what I've learned and how I interpret this data and this research, is that what is natural is the fact that we are able to adapt and change according to our environment and express ourselves in all these behavioral ways. I try to say that in the least convoluted sense, but I'm sorry if so for example, the fact that we can be angry, that anger isn't isn't what's natural. The ability for your behavior to eventually become through biological processes like chemical reactions and so forth, neurological development and brain activity, for you to be able to adapt to that behavior, that's what's natural. It's the process of getting there that's natural. What's not natural is anger itself. Anger is a consequence of your environment, period. You don't get angry because you're well fed and happy and loved and treated well. That doesn't happen unless there's a genetic anomaly, something that's not natural, something that's aberrant, that's something that's so rare, different than what statistically is what's considered normal, or I should say statistically prevalent in gene expression. That's the anomalies are what are rare, but people tend to focus on those anomalies, or at the very least, they focus on these behaviors, which are, again, they're just expressions of some of a thing that is induced by your environment.
I agree with what you're saying, and I know what you're getting at with the rabbi comment. It's kind of too simplistic. At the end, he's like, "Okay, let's find the best suited role for an angry person. Let's find the best suited role for a docile person." But why are they angry in the first place? What developmental characteristics were they lacking? We all have anger. We have the ability to express anger, but if you are a normally angry person, that is as a result of your lack of being taught how to deal with that anger, or having too much external influence to cause that anger. It's not okay to say, well, they're just an angry person. Are they an angry person, or are they lacking the ability to manage anger, or did it come from something that they saw when they grew up and that's why they now have these traits?
I want to tell you a story, and this is something that I think it will give an idea of why it bothers me so much. And I spend a lot. I mean, I have a lot of kids, but I also am very good at, especially when it comes to teaching and educating kids about these very complex philosophical and ideological ideas. And so when I met a kid once, a boy who had a brother. He was very violent. He was very violent, like in a scary. He may end the existence of somebody, especially his brother. He may end his existence just because he feels like it. He seemed to take joy in the pain that his brother felt. Whereas his brother was like this happy-go-lucky, upbeat, positive, chipper, friendly, like the dude was like fantastic when it comes to his behavior. Also fair. He's You know, he's what people would call, and Sapolsky talked about this during an interview I listened to recently. He said, if you're born attractive, symmetrically what's considered generally attractive, you will receive better treatment. Well, the one brother who was being abused essentially was more attractive. The other one was not. Heavy set, not very friendly, not very expressive, harder to connect, all the things, right? There's all these things happening. And my perspective was, it was clear to me what was going on. Clear. I didn't have to see that much more. I knew exactly what was going on. I knew he gets treated differently than the other one. The one that's being abusive is being treated differently than the one that's being abused. And I found out over time that this one boy, the one that was abusive, he wasn't just treated differently by everyone in his life. His friends treated him differently. His family treated him differently. His parents treated him differently. His mother and his father treated him differently. And you could see that when he did something wrong, even when it was something that was simple, he was treated differently. He wasn't as smart. There's a lot of things that were just like, he just was so disadvantaged in the sociological sense. That was why he was doing all these things. It wasn't because he was genetically predisposed to say anything, you know, and it frustrates the heck out of me. And I'm trying not to curse here because I know, based off of not just experience, but experiments, that these kinds of aberrant behaviors, they express themselves in dangerous ways. The very first video we played was Hitler and Buddha. I mean, they're both human. Why did they turn out so differently? Because Hitler's genetically predisposed to be this way? To be like, no. There are environmental factors that influence them to become who they are, period. And that's why I get so frustrated, because this thinking, it's not just something that we can just casually believe. It's what influences us to make decisions for everybody else if we're in a position to make those decisions. Or even worse, if we vote for people who make decisions for everyone else and they believe these things, there's the danger for me. And that's why I tend to be very passionate about this topic, because I think it's important for people to see each other from a more compassionate and empathetic perspective, where we see you are me and I am you. I could be just like you if I was in that situation. I could say all day long, if I was, I can do this, I can do that, I'm this, and I overcame this. But what if I was you? Yeah. Could I do all those things?
Would you have slipped on the same stumbling blocks that guy did, that you're now saying, oh, he's a loser, an alcoholic, his wife left him? If those same external things happen to you, we really don't know how we would have handled things or how we would have done.
Yeah. And
great point on that the story you brought up,
because generational, by the way. Sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah. And your point brings up what can happen with the example of the kid who's treated differently at home. He sees it's clearly unfair that his brother can screw up and not get scolded. He does something so insignificant and gets yelled at. What happens if you fast forward 20 years? What are kids that are raised that way? How do they develop in relationships, and how do they behave in relationships? So we've got Gabor Mate here on sort of pain reflexes that we carry, or baggage, as you will, from early life trauma, and how that kind of screws up our relationships in the future, or at least it can if we're not aware of it.
A therapist once said to me that if your parents didn't know how to hold you, you develop the mind you hold yourself with. So you find safety in this mind that you created. And so the human mind, the ordinary egoic human mind, is basically a defensive structure. It's, in significant ways, it's a response to pain. That's not all it is, but in significant ways, it's a response to pain. It's afraid of pain, and it's designed to keep you from experiencing pain. So it's worried, and it's anxious, and it's defensive. So when it comes to change and vulnerability, the mind wants to defend against it. And so it comes out of fear, which comes out of childhood experience, where the pain that you had wasn't held. And therefore, you develop these mind structures to keep you from experiencing it.
Can you play, and this is just because it just dovetails perfectly off of what you just played, the trauma and addiction one.
Sure.
When children are traumatized, one of the ways they cope with it is to soothe themselves, and then that's where addictions come in. But another way to cope would be is if you get the message that you're not good enough, that you are not worthy enough, then you might spend the rest of your life trying to prove that you are. And how do you do that? By being very nice to everybody. By never saying how you feel, because they might not like how you feel. by never expressing healthy anger when somebody's crossing your boundaries, by working too hard to prove that you're worthwhile. That's why I was a workaholic doctor, because I got the message as an infant, as a Jewish infant under the Nazis in the Second World War. I got the message that the world didn't want me, I wasn't good enough. Well, then you spend the rest of your life compensating by taking on too much, and you're stressing yourself, and those stresses have an impact on your physiology.
Yeah, it's essentially me in the last 22 years of my career, right? But I honestly don't think it's that. Like I didn't work myself because it was a fear of like not feeling good enough. It was just the desire to win. I didn't want to work until I'm 65. So like in a workforce, I
Yeah.
was willing to put in the extra labor and, be underpaid for 2 years. But then I can say, hey, I've been doing this for 2 years. Now you either give me the title or I'm going over here where I have the credential. I just saw it as a drive to succeed, and not even from a monetary level. I just really liked winning. I always played sports. I'm a goalie when I would play hockey. And if I go and, sub for my buddy's hockey team, I don't know any of those people, but I want to win. And I'll be yelling at the defense if they're getting in my way. Like, yeah, it's a game, but I take it seriously. I'm not here to screw around, and my wife has a hard time dealing with that business Louis when it comes to at home Louis, because it's not that I don't know how to stop. I'm just willing to outwork, outsmart, outlast, all the stuff from the Survivor show. I've always been willing to do
you
those.
are.
Just as it's like because I don't feel right knowing that, hey, this is my check. If I had worked properly, how much could I have made? I never want to leave anything on the table, and I think it's just because of my job, seeing what my dad had to do to work to the age of 65 or whatever. I don't want to do that. So how do I get ahead? Okay, well, all my buddies are out drinking and partying. I'm going to go to school, or I'm just going to work and develop experience and, read things that expand my mind. You mentioned Wayne Dyer. He was influential in my life. Went and saw him at a conference in Toronto. And I feel like I just put in the work. So whatever came as a result of that was, seeds that were planted years before. I never saw it. And maybe I'm just wrong. I mean, Gabor Mate is very intelligent. He's a psychologist. He's Canadian, actually. He was born in Hungary as a Jewish person. Family had to leave as a result of the fallout from World War II, moved to Canada, became a physician, and now he's an extremely, best-selling author and just a inspirational guy. So, I mean, I don't see it that I was never told I wasn't good enough. I was always told you can do it. If you think you can beat everybody at this, you can. Like, the only thing that you cannot do is if you believe you can't do it. So I saw it more as a motivation to just get busy, like very conscious of the fact that we got one go at this round of life. Just make something of it. And maybe it's the fact that I was supposed to be a doctor, did the med school thing, realized it wasn't for me. And I guess it could have been the fear of not wanting to let my parents down, thinking, hey, they're immigrants. I couldn't read or write English. Now their kid has a chance to be a cardiologist. I didn't want to be a bum and disappoint them. So maybe that was it was the fear of becoming good, not that I ever had that in the first place. So maybe there is a dynamic there I'm not even aware of.
Listen, you've fallen into this is what warms my heart. because I recognize something, and this is, I feel like, people don't see, it's very difficult to see past your own pain, right? And it's also very difficult to see outside of yourself. And so when people are looking in, and keep in mind, everyone, I do have ADHD. If you don't know what that's like, if you think you know what it's like, I don't think you do, because it can be debilitating. It can be very disruptive to your life. And you don't realize it until, again, it's as I get older, I realize it more and more. But I always ask myself as well, I know I believe kind of the idea that comes from a place of trauma. I'm going to tell a personal story here. And I'm not going to put this behind, Patreon. When I was a young boy, and I'm talking very young, probably, I want to say like 4 or 5 years old. I will never forget this. Most of my childhood, I don't remember. I remember moments that I will never forget. My mother, I had a very challenging childhood. And I remember one day I was playing with my toys in a corner of a room. And my mom was dating some guy. I'm not going to say his name because who knows who's listening. But I will never forget his name either. And he was a pretty buff dude. His family was very wealthy. They had a lot of money. I'm talking like massive, several story home that was on this massive property with like a really big drive. I mean, they were just very wealthy people. But he was a mess up. So they didn't really do a lot for him because of that. Sometimes they give him money. And my mom and him were in he was a very abusive guy. I remember playing with my toys, and I heard rustling in the corner. Now, for those of you who have issues with domestic abuse, trigger alert, trigger warning, I recommend skipping past the next 2 to 3 minutes or 2 to 5 minutes, whatever. So just so we have that set, trigger warning for those who have sensitivities to domestic violence. I hear this rustling and then weird breathing noises. And I look over, and this guy has my mother up by one arm against the door with her feet dangling, kicking the back of the door. And I look over, and I had a Stretch Armstrong at the time. I just got this toy. And I'm holding this Stretch Armstrong, looking at her and him, and the look in his eyes, like he was willing to end everything for her. And he didn't, you could just see it. And then she looked at me, right? And that moment she looked at me, I thought to myself, is he going to, take her out? I don't want to say the word because of YouTube. And if he takes her out, what's going to happen to her, right? What happens if he does end it for her? And then I thought to myself, is he going to do that to me? And I just kept thinking, like, what happens if we both are ended? Will we go to sleep and then wake back up, or does it just go black? What happens next? I just kept thinking this until eventually after a while, it stopped. And I don't want to go over those details because it's even worse. But that moment is singed into my brain forever, right? And now as an adult, I reject violence in so many, especially as raising kids and with a partner. I reject it entirely. I reject it so much. I'm very docile, very, very, I'm less inclined to be violent because I've seen what violence can do. I saw that. Now, some people will take that and they'll become like more violent and more aggressive because of seeing that. I saw that and I thought to myself, I never want to see or experience that again. I never want to be a person that shows this towards anybody else. The trauma that I've learned from. I've learned from that trauma. I've become something because of that trauma, and I have behaviors as a consequence of that trauma. So I do think that these things, these traumas, and the ADHD, the not paying attention and so forth, that actually it could be because I didn't want to pay attention to so many moments in my life. I tried so hard to forget them so that I wouldn't have to remember. And so many of my bad experiences, so many of my regular experiences, I try not to remember because there's so many bad ones that I don't want to remember. And I feel like it could be, I'm not a doctor, but it could be the ADHD could be an expression of that trauma manifesting.
And we have a clip actually on that exact thing. But before I play it, I want to ask you, do you have a theory on why you choose nonviolence in your life? You've gone the Gandhi way, not the Hitler way. Do you have a theory on why you came out one way or the other?
Because I love my mom, and I didn't want her to feel pain, and I didn't want anybody to feel pain. One day when my dad passed away, wow, this is what is this called? Psychoanalysis 101. When my dad passed away, I was a very popular kid. I did backflips and I was a ninja, did backflips and kung fu and all that stuff. People loved hanging out with me because I was very entertaining, funny, energetic, calmer now as I got older. But my dad died, and not one person, not one of all the people that wanted to hang out with me, not one of them asked me if I was okay. Not one. And in that moment, I knew, after having experienced what I experienced with my mom as a teenager, still, I experienced it my entire childhood. I never wanted anyone else to feel what I felt then. And everything that I saw, my whole perspective was shaped by that. I don't want anybody to feel this. I don't want like the things that I've seen. I don't want anyone to ever experience that. That's what shaped.
Now, in your case, you were fortunate, and I don't want to dwell on the story, but you were fortunate that everybody survived. It was a horrible experience. Now, what if it was worst case scenario? Nobody
Yeah.
survived. You witnessed that. You
I
have
don't.
that implanted. Do you think you'd be more likely to be a violent person because in that moment, there's nothing to salvage
Yeah.
anymore. You saw the worst of humankind, and that hatred and that anger, you may not be able to get out of your system. Do you think it would have gone differently had it ended differently?
Well, that's a good question because if let's say that at that moment my mother would have not made it, I wouldn't have gone through this series of events that led me to the point where I learned how to become a man.
Right.
I would never have encountered the people that taught me that the world isn't like what you've known it to be as a child. That there is something more to life than just the kind of lifestyles that I experienced as a child. I had to get out of the place that I live to see that there's so much more out there. The world is bigger. And everybody, a lot of my peers, especially around where I live, they're pretty much all the same because where I live it's a very small place. And so there's not a lot of exposure to the outside world. You get a lot of ideologies that are based off of that small-minded and limited perspective. Not their fault. I do not think it's their fault. I don't believe that. But there's a lot that we could talk about potentially at another time that I can explain to you how these things, if I were to stay here, I would have been stuck here. Or I would have went to my grandmother's house, my dad's house, which would have been not so great either. Although my grandmother was awesome, it was not much different in terms of the people that I would have been around anyway, aside from my grandmother. So I do believe that I do not think that I would have been anything like I was today if it wasn't for every single thing that happened in my life up to this point.
Sure. I totally agree with that too. We are the sum of the experiences, the observations,
Yeah.
the memories. If you have a good association with going over to grandma's and she bakes apple pie and left it out in the window and you're playing outside carefree,
Yep.
every time you smell apple pie, you're going to get a flashback of that. And we know that olfaction is linked to memory. You can smell something and instantly get a memory of something that reminds you of that smell. Now, if somebody was sexually abused at that same house, the smell of apple pie would trigger that memory
Yeah.
instead.
Yeah.
So that is exactly
Fear.
true. We are the byproduct of what we've gone through. And you mentioned ADHD, and we covered big pharma in our gene editing episodes. The tendency in psychology is just medicate. Your kid's hyperactive, give them this. And rather than looking at how is the behavior being managed, not just medicate and give them a Band-Aid. And a lot of things have been accepted or been adopted as, well, they have a mental condition like ADHD. Maybe it's not a mental condition. Maybe it is a byproduct of these things we were talking about, the upbringing, the circumstances you were put in, the type of household. Was there a prevalence of violence or not? Was it supportive or not? Was it religiously? Did it not help you? A lot of people are refuting religion or pushing back on religion. They didn't have a good religious experience. It was forced down their throat, or they were told that if they didn't do certain things, they were going to hell. If they touched themselves as an adolescent teen, they're going to hell. There's been a lot of uses of control. So is it the religion that's bad, or is it how the religion was used to manipulate this person that's bad? And they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We can get into religion another day, but here's Gabor Mate on ADHD and past trauma. Very interesting.
The brain can change if you treat it right. So the reliance on medications that we have is a real poverty of the spirit, a real poverty of imagination, a poverty of medical education. So the average doctor never learns this stuff. The average physician never gets a single lecture on brain development, how the brain develops in interaction with their environment. So when you're seeing, and let alone do they hear about trauma, they don't, hardly at all.
Right.
So when they see an adult with ADHD or depression or addiction or bipolar conditions or for that matter, autoimmune illness or anything else, they don't think of trauma. They just think of this disease. And they think that the diagnosis explains everything, but the diagnosis don't explain anything. Because think about it. Let's say Gabor or Joe goes to a doctor and they diagnose with ADHD. Well, what are the hallmarks of ADHD? Well, tuning out, poor impulse regulation, maybe hyperactivity. Why does Gabor have poor impulse control, hyperactivity, and tuning out? Because he's got ADHD. How do we know he's got ADHD? Because he's got poor impulse control and tunes out, and he's hyperactive. Why is he hyperactive, tunes out, have poor impulse control? He's got ADHD. How do we know he's got ADHD? Because, it's circular. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't explain anything. Diagnoses describe things, and that they can be helpful that way, but they don't explain.
It becomes this circle of ignorance, right? Who says it's like the chicken and the egg? All of a sudden, this person's behaving this way because of their condition.
Right.
But how do you know that that's the condition? Well, because they have these symptoms. It's not getting to the root of the issue.
Two things that I think about, it's why, right? Why, where does it come from? Why is it there? If you're talking about, you're taking a collection of behaviors and you're defining them, but you're not explaining, like he said, why those behaviors are expressing themselves. That's the key. So for me, it's a lot of conversations that happen around these topics are ideological at their core. They don't really go into the why, the real reason. I read a book called, I think it's called, Why Do Good People Do Bad Things? Or something like that. I think it's called Why Do Good People Do Bad Things, but I'm not entirely sure at the moment. Or Why Good People Do Bad Things. Understanding our darker selves. And it's very Freudian. And I 100% believe when you think about, for example, what do we idolize today? A CEO is one of the highest positions that a person can have in the corporate world, right? One of. People aspire to be the CEO of a company, to be the CEO, to be a business owner, someone who owns and operates their own business and, is making money and has a certain amount of whatever. But a lot of CEOs that are the most successful cause the most damage to the world. like more than the biggest kind of theft in America, I believe in the world actually, is wage theft. It's when employers steal from their employees. And when you think about that, that means that we are aspiring to be the worst kind of people in the world, the ones that are causing the greatest amount of pain to the world. And so the whole point of me getting to that point was that we're not looking at, for example, what does it mean, or what does it mean? We're describing these things, but we're not getting to the core of why they are there. Why is it that a person would do something bad? Why does a person have ADHD, which is just a description of a collection of behaviors? Why do they have those behaviors? We're not getting to that. We're just sticking at, this is what it is, and this is how you make it stop expressing itself. Why is it expressing itself?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it goes back to the original argument that some will carry that this is in your genes. And we mentioned before the break sort of the whole epigenetic thing. So from a very biological point of view, if you don't want to talk about the philosophy or anything that's sort of esoteric as how we develop, from a strictly biological point of view, top left corner, your chromosome, you have epigenetic mechanisms. So these develop in utero or early childhood. Environmental chemicals can cause changes in these mechanisms, drugs or pharmaceuticals. That's why big pharma giving kids Ritalin, not a good idea. It is not the solution unless they are severely dependent or lacking a chemical. Then yes, you have, if you're bipolar, you need that extra chemical to not be bipolar. I get that. But just about everything else, I think, is causation and not true biological effect. But other things like aging and diet also affect into that. So the chromosomes form this chromatin, this spiral of chromosomes, and the DNA itself, and then DNA methylation. So methylation is an epigenetic factor found in some dietary sources. So just from a strict angle of diet, eating poorly or lack of exercise or high toxicity of chemicals can change that methyl group of your DNA. So, and at the very end, the bottom right-hand corner, this histone trail or tail, you have this epigenetic factor, which is now there, like they mentioned earlier in one of the video clips, everybody has cancer. What makes that turn on? Well, things like in utero development, environmental chemicals, aging, diet, stress can have end results that could be things like cancer, autoimmune disease, mental disorders, or diabetes. So those are things that person may have been born with a predisposition towards, but what turns it on? And it is all those things, the nurture, that can turn on those epigenetic factors that, right from a biological point of view, even if you don't believe that upbringing has anything to do, that you don't have free will, okay,
Right.
if you're pure Robert Sapolsky on it, there is still at a genetic level a reason that, yes, stress, diet, aging, smoking, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, they can still manipulate you in a way that your genetics and your DNA did not mutate prior to you inheriting it. It's one thing if you're gene deficient because both your parents carry the Down syndrome, genetic precursor. It's not dominant in either of them, so they don't have Down syndrome, but the offspring could. Hence the ideas with inbreeding and things like that's not a good idea, because they may not be present, or they may not be dominant, but still present in your genetic factor. So, but what makes those things turn on? That is kind of where I think the mystery lies in this, right? Why does it happen in some and not the others? Why do some people, in fact, like if you look at being a sociopath, somebody invented a scan. I believe it was a Canadian doctor actually invented a brain scan to test for, or even a DNA test, that you may have this precursor for psychopathy. And the guy who developed a scan realized that I actually have it myself. Like he realized that about himself. But he's not a psychopathic killer. Why did it not turn on in him, but it could in somebody else? Is it the upbringing? Again, then you start getting into people saying, well, we could test kids to see if they're going to wind up being mass shooters in a school one day. Yeah, but you might equally not be that if nurtured, loved, and raised correctly. If the nurture is there, those things don't get turned on, right? You don't get cancer and autoimmune disease necessarily without those epigenetic stressors or things to cause that. You may, depending on the cancer, it's complicated, but it might just be that external environment was enough to do the trick. And that's why some develop and display and others don't.
I watched a TV show once. One of my favorite TV shows is called The Dead Zone. And not the old one or the book, which both are good as well. The newer one, like the 2000s Dead Zone, was fantastic. There was this one episode where Johnny, the main character, he has this ability where he can see the past, present, or future of anything he touches, and of course anything connected to that, at least relevant to the object or person or whatever. Really interesting show, by the way. You should definitely check it. There's a lot of moral and a lot of things that are taught in that show that I take from that and apply to my personal life. But there's this episode of a boy who he sees committing a school shooting. And the whole episode is essentially him trying to change that outcome. What is the thing that makes him that way? And through his journey to try to stop this kid by changing what happens, he learns about why this kid's this way. There's got a lot of family problems, a lot of them. And that's why he got that way. Plus, the school was implementing these really ridiculous policies that were essentially caused him to commit this act on top of his personality. And eventually, he goes through the whole thing and then he stops it. But then he finds out that it's not just, and I don't want to give the spoiler alert, but then he finds out something else towards the end, that sighting that he saw, because he couldn't see the person committing the violence. He only saw the violence being committed by coming into physical contact with that kid. Wasn't him. It was somebody in a different generation. And the crazy thing is that all these things, all these little incidents, everything, the upbringing of this child, the environmental influences, the school, the sociological, socioeconomical situation, all of it led to not just him potentially committing a violent act, a heinous one, but a following generation as well. Fantastic. You'd have to see it. There's a lot of episodes, but that one episode, I don't want to spoil all of it, but there's a lot to that episode, more than what I just mentioned. But I feel like it kind of ties into what we're talking about.
Yeah, especially the generational. That was something that I didn't know. I knew quite a bit about this topic, but doing the research for the show, you start reading into like that little diagram of your grandma had your mom, which had the ovaries already and the eggs for you.
That was cool.
So like literally for the first time, we're learning that the implications of this could be multi-generational. Again, the people that are strict environmental believers will say, no, it's nonsense. And I have a clip here from Bruce Lipton in reference to Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and also other child psychologists over the years that have said, give me a kid till the age of 7, I can turn him into anything. So this is kind of
Yeah.
a little clip on sort of the idea that it's what we do, and it's nothing to do with that, or the complete opposite.
Give me a child until it's 7 and I will show you the man. And it's just based on how you grew up, what you see. Look, this is not new. I mean, there's the famous book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And basically said you come from a poor family and you could struggle your whole life and try to get rich, but you're not going to make it. And if you come from a rich family, you could be stupid your whole life and make it.
Unless I make a conscious effort.
The conscious effort to change your programming. Just when you're just falling off into sleep, consciousness is disconnecting. The next period of your brain operation while your consciousness is disconnected is theta, which is the same brain function as in the first 7 years. So if you put a pair of earphones on at night with a program of what you would like to be true in your life, as soon as your conscious mind disconnects, that program is playing. It's not playing into your conscious mind, that's shut off. It's now going straight into the subconscious mind. So it's called auto-hypnosis.
So essentially, he's saying we have a choice. We can deprogram ourselves. But if you're doing the deprogramming, it means you believe that there is a programming in the first place. So hence nurture, or the lack thereof, caused these issues, but we're not hopeless, right? And like you said, you mentioned, we ran a few scenarios here of what if this household happened, how would the person be? Or what about if that person didn't have exposure to this? Essentially, it comes down to education. It comes down to learning that we have tendencies as humans. Some we inherit genetically, some are as a result of the culture and experiences around us. So knowing that, I think, is what gives us that free will that Robert Sapolsky says we don't have. It's the education to know that you don't have to suffer. What you're feeling is normal, considering what you went through. Others feel exactly the same way, also as a result of what they went through, that you're not stuck with, oh, I got crappy genes, I guess I'm doomed. I don't think it's that simplistic. There are many scientists that say, yes, that in fact is the case. If your parents didn't go to college, you won't either, and all the rest. I think those are social issues. They are not genetic issues.
I literally just heard this. Gabriel Mate actually said, he was in an interview where he said that there was an experiment done where, there was one child who was a set of children that was like loved and nurtured and stuff like that. Another one was not, and you would think that the child that was not would become that was disciplined and treated a little bit more harshly, would turn out to be self-reliant, self-sufficient, independent, motivated to do things on our own, and so forth. However, the studies show that it's the exact opposite. That the child that is loved and nurtured and treated with that kind of tenderness at a young age, they do become more healthier mentally and emotionally, and they become more functional. Now, that does not mean spoiled. There is a difference.
Yeah. Because those same kids at my school that were smashing their dad's car, it was just like, daddy's only here to give me allowance. Daddy's busy working. He's out with his mistress. They're not present familial parents. There is no warm, loving environment. They just treat problems with money. And that's why those kids turned out to be degenerate losers. They never really got the love. So by all appearances, they looked like, wow, that kid's got everything going for him. His dad's a lawyer. They live in a $4 million house. His first car is a brand new Audi. Like, what's he got to complain about? I'm taking the bus and my parents can barely pay their bills. But we mistake that showering with gifts and financial ability. Then that's why I don't believe that the lack of financial stability affects the development of the neocortex. I think that is nonsense. I think it is the behavior from the parents, the environment at home. Those conditions are what mold a young person. Now, again, you go to the extreme level. If poverty is so great that, there's malnutrition and all the rest, and then addiction, then your environmental structure collapses, and that is in effect, one causes the other. But generally speaking, if we're talking about people that are able to meet their needs and just, 10 kids in a classroom, the ones that feel like they're heard, that feel like they're respected, feel like they have space to make mistakes without judgment, typically they will do better than those who just come from really strict parents. Even if those parents are rich and give them everything, the kids are going, this guy's got all the advantages, but you might be the poor kid with all the advantages because you're learning the real goods about life, things that will benefit you in 20 years' time that you don't even know at that point. you know,
Right.
where are they going to be? Where are you going to be when the money runs out? You know?
Yeah. I'll save because there's a lot that we could talk about. I'm gonna save my response for a future conversation about maybe poverty or wealth or or something like that. Socioeconomic. Who knows? We'll talk about so many different things. We'll get there eventually. There's a lot that I have to say about that. Obviously, we see things a little bit differently, but only because I think you think we do.
Isn't
And I'm
that how
gonna
it is
prove
with everybody? We all
that
think we're so different from each other. Really, we're all the same. We're just
we are all, dude.
different set of eyeglasses on.
100%, brother.
Yeah. Well, great show again, Marquise. And thank you, everybody, for staying and watching with us today. This is our longest episode we've done. If you do like these shows, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to our channels yet, please do. We are on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and the UNX Network on Sunday nights. And with that, we will bring our show to a close. I want to thank my co-host, Marquise Williams, for joining me as always. Fantastic chat, buddy. And everybody else, please join us in our after show through our Quantum Club. Link is in the description. And until next time, take care of each other, and we'll see you again soon.